Late one foggy evening, Claire hurried through the deserted platform of Eastbourne Station, her breath puffing in the frigid air. The last train home sat idling on the tracks, its doors open like a beckoning mouth. She hesitated for a moment, unnerved by the station's eerie stillness. The usual chatter of other late-night commuters was conspicuously absent, and the faint scent of damp stone and rust hung in the air. The faint chime signaling the train's imminent departure jolted her into action. Claire stepped aboard, the doors hissing shut behind her. She glanced around. The carriage was sparsely occupied. A man in a rumpled suit stared blankly out the window, a young woman nervously fidgeted with her phone, and an older woman sat clutching a worn leather bag tightly to her chest. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the train pulled away, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. Claire sank into a seat near the middle of the carriage, exhaling a sigh of relief. She leaned her head against the window, the cool glass soothing against her temple. Outside, the familiar city lights blurred past, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to relax. But as the train continued, an unsettling feeling crept over her. The usual stops came and went, or rather they didn't. No announcements, no slowing of the train, just a relentless push forward. She straightened, glancing at the digital display above the door. It should have read the name of the next station, but instead, it blinked erratically, displaying nonsensical characters before going blank entirely. The cityscape outside began to change. The high-rise buildings and busy streets gave way to sprawling, darkened fields and dense forests. The trees seemed wrong, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches clawing at the foggy sky. Shadows moved between them, flickering just out of view. Claire's stomach churned. "This isn't right," she murmured. The man across from her didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on the window, unblinking. She turned to the young woman a few rows down. "Excuse me, do you know what's going on?" The woman's head snapped up, her wide eyes filled with panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she shook her head frantically before burying her face in her hands. Claire's unease deepened. She turned her attention to the older woman, who now seemed to be whispering under her breath. The words were too quiet to make out, but the cadence was rhythmic, almost ritualistic. Claire's pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, hoping to call someone, anyone. But the screen remained dark, refusing to power on. Around her, the oppressive silence grew heavier, broken only by the faint, disjointed murmurs of the passengers. The train plunged into a tunnel. The darkness outside was absolute, and for a moment, Claire felt as though the train was floating through a void. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like a distant breeze, but they grew louder, layered, indistinct voices overlapping until they filled her ears. She clamped her hands over them, squeezing her eyes shut. When the train emerged from the tunnel, the world outside had transformed entirely. Gone were the fields and forests. Instead, a barren wasteland stretched to the horizon. The ground was cracked and dry, littered with jagged rocks and the husks of long-dead trees. Buildings, or what remained of them, jutted out at odd angles, their structures warped as if melted and frozen mid-collapse. The sky above was an unsettling shade of gray, streaked with veins of sickly green light. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She rose from her seat and approached the nearest passenger, the man in the suit. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He turned to her slowly, his face pale and drawn. His eyes, sunken and glassy, locked onto hers. "Don't leave the train," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No matter what." Before she could press him further, the train lurched to a stop. Claire stumbled, catching herself on a nearby pole. The intercom crackled to life, emitting a distorted voice. "Final stop. Please exit." The doors slid open, revealing a station bathed in darkness. Faint lights flickered along the platform, casting long, distorted shadows. The air was thick, almost tangible, and carried a faint metallic tang. No signs or markings indicated where they were. One by one, the other passengers began to rise. The young woman clutched her phone tightly, her expression vacant. The older woman continued her whispered chant, stepping off the train without hesitation. Even the man in the suit, who had warned her moments ago, shuffled toward the open doors as if in a trance. "Wait," Claire called after him. "You said not to leave." He paused, turning his head slightly. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "It's worse if you stay." Claire's chest tightened. She peered out at the platform, her instincts screaming at her to stay put. But as the last passenger stepped off, the train's interior lights began to flicker. The whispers returned, louder now, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She felt the pull of the void outside, a silent invitation wrapped in foreboding. "Final stop," the intercom repeated, the voice more insistent. Claire stood frozen at the threshold, torn between two equally terrifying choices. Outside, the shadows seemed to writhe, shapes forming and dissolving within them. Inside, the train groaned, its metal frame trembling as though it might collapse in on itself. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the platform, the train's doors slammed shut behind her, and it sped away into the darkness, leaving her utterly alone. The whispers ceased. The air grew still. Claire turned, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions with no clear exit in sight. And then she saw them. Figures standing just beyond the edge of the flickering lights, their shapes indistinct but their presence undeniable. They watched her, unmoving, waiting. Claire's breath hitched as the realization sunk in. She had left the train, but she hadn't escaped.